My boots were still stained with the fresh mud from that morning's harvest. The rich brown soil had dried into the cracks of the leather after hours spent in the greenhouse before sunrise. I had tried to wipe them clean before leaving the farm, but anyone who works the land knows the truth. Some dirt never really comes off. As I stepped into the ballroom, I noticed every eye drifting toward polished Italian shoes, expensive heels, tailored tuxedos, sparkling jewelry, and designer gowns. The crystal chandeliers reflected across marble floors so perfectly that every expensive shoe looked like it was floating on water. Mine looked like they had just walked out of a field. Maybe they had. Around me stood nearly 200 guests. Business owners, lawyers, politicians, executives, people whose watches cost more than my first tractor. Meanwhile, I stood quietly near the entrance wearing simple clothes, work boots, and hands that still carried tiny cuts from trimming orchid stems before dawn. No one greeted me. No one asked if I was family. Several people smiled politely. The same smile reserved for caterers and event staff. I'd gotten used to it years ago. What none of them knew was that every white orchid decorating that magnificent ballroom had been grown in my greenhouse. Every centerpiece, every bouquet, every flower hanging from the ceiling had passed through my hands. The heirloom tomatoes in the salad? Mine. The fresh herbs inside the sauce everyone kept complimenting? Mine. The baby greens served beneath the expensive seafood? Mine too. Even the flowers decorating the wedding cake had come from my farm. And none of them knew that 3 weeks earlier, I had quietly wired $40,000 to the caterer. No recognition, no announcement, no thank you speech. Only one condition. No one was ever to know who paid for any of it, because today wasn't supposed to be about me. It was my younger brother Daniel's wedding, and despite everything, I wanted him to have the beautiful day he deserved. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the quietest people often carry the strongest hearts, and where the last word always belongs to the person nobody expected. My name is Emma Harrison. I'm 34 years old. I grow food for a living. If you're watching today, let me know where you're watching from. And if stories about quiet strength, family betrayal, and unexpected justice speak to you, make sure you subscribe, because this story changed my life forever. The day had started long before the sun. At 4 o'clock that morning, the world outside my greenhouse was still wrapped in darkness. Only the faint hum of the heaters and the soft clicking of irrigation lines broke the silence. Inside, thousands of white orchids waited beneath rows of warm lights. Beautiful, delicate, perfect. I slipped on my gloves, picked up my floral knife, and began cutting each stem one by one. Every cut had to be perfect. Too short, the arrangement would look uneven. Too long, the flowers would wilt before the ceremony. I checked every stem individually, trimmed each at an angle, wrapped them carefully in damp cloth, packed them into refrigerated crates. 40 crates in total, by myself. My employees had offered to help. I refused. They've got families, I told Sophia. I'm not asking anyone else to lose sleep because my brother is getting married. Sophia only smiled. She knew me too well to argue. Sophia Reyes had been running operations beside me for almost 12 years. If I was the heart of Harrison Farms, Sophia was the engine. Nothing escaped her attention. She noticed irrigation leaks before sensors did. She could estimate harvest weights just by walking through a field. She remembered every employee's children's birthdays. And unlike almost everyone else in my family, she never looked at my hands and saw dirt. She looked at them and saw work. As I finished loading the final crate, she handed me a thermos of coffee. You've been awake since midnight, so have you. I get paid. You deserve more. She laughed. You'll never stop trying to take care of everyone, will you? I looked across the greenhouse. Rows upon rows of flowers stretched toward the ceiling. I learned from Mom. That made both of us quiet. Even after 15 years, saying Mom still changed the room. My mother believed plants could tell when someone loved them. People laughed whenever she said it. But somehow, our flowers always bloomed bigger than everyone else's. She used to kneel beside me in the soil when I was little. She'd place tiny seeds into my hand, close my fingers gently, and whisper, "The earth doesn't care how much money someone has. It only asks whether they showed up." Back then, I thought she was talking about gardening. Years later, I realized she'd been talking about people. By 7:30, every flower had reached the ballroom. I stayed behind while decorators arranged them. Watching strangers admire my work, without knowing whose hands had created it, had become strangely familiar. One woman gasped, "Oh my goodness, these orchids must have cost a fortune." Another nodded, "They're extraordinary." I smiled quietly from across the room. Sometimes, being unseen hurts. Sometimes, it's peaceful. That morning, I still believed it was peaceful. I wouldn't believe that by the end of the night, Daniel had always been different from the rest of us. Where my father valued ambition, Daniel valued kindness. Where Vanessa competed, Daniel listened. As children, he'd spend entire afternoons following me around the farm. He'd fall asleep in the truck while I watered tomatoes. He once cried because a rabbit had gotten caught in fencing. That was Daniel. Gentle, soft-hearted, never embarrassed by dirt, never embarrassed by me, which is why I never hesitated to help pay for his wedding. Because, unlike everyone else, he had never once asked me to become someone else before he loved me. The ballroom slowly filled with guests. Laughter echoed beneath crystal chandeliers. Champagne glasses clinked. Photographers rushed from table to table. Everywhere I looked, people admired the decorations. No one admired the farmer who had grown them. And honestly, I preferred it that way. Or at least, I thought I did. I had spent nearly 15 years convincing myself that staying invisible was the same thing as staying safe. It wasn't courage. It wasn't humility. It was survival. Because in my family, being noticed usually meant becoming someone's target. So I stayed in the background. Quiet people learned that trick early. Smile, help, disappear, repeat. I thought that was strength. I hadn't yet learned the difference between peace and surrender. As I adjusted one of the centerpieces near the back of the ballroom, the head caterer, Dolores, caught my eye. She was the only other person who knew the truth. The only person besides Sophia who knew where every flower, every vegetable, every herb, and every dollar had really come from. She gave me a tiny nod, a silent thank you. I nodded back. No words. None were needed. Then I noticed a single orchid petal lying on the floor. I bent down, picked it up carefully, slipped it into my pocket. A habit my mother had taught me. Never leave beauty where someone can step on it. I smiled to myself. If only beauty were the only thing people stepped on. I had no idea that before the night was over, my own father would humiliate me in front of 200 people. And even less idea that just 1 week later, the entire future of his company would rest inside my hands. The ceremony began exactly at 3 o'clock. Music floated softly through the ballroom as every guest rose to their feet. I quietly slipped into the last row, exactly where I wanted to be. Not because there weren't better seats. There were. But after years of family gatherings, I had learned something important. The farther away I sat, the fewer opportunities people had to remind me that I didn't belong. From the back, I watched Daniel standing at the altar. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from love. When Chloe appeared at the entrance in her wedding dress, tears immediately filled his eyes. I smiled. So did I. Some people cry because something is ending. I cried because something beautiful was finally beginning for my little brother. For 20 peaceful minutes, nothing else mattered. Not my father, not Vanessa, not the company, not the years of feeling invisible. Only Daniel, only family. Or at least, the version of family I still wished existed. As applause filled the ballroom after the ceremony, guests poured toward the reception hall. Servers carried silver trays of champagne. The band began playing soft jazz. Every table sparkled beneath candlelight. I looked around quietly. Every flower arrangement stood exactly where I had imagined it weeks before. Every orchid had opened perfectly. Every centerpiece looked alive. Seeing them made every sleepless night worth it. No one knew they were looking at months of my work. And strangely, that had never bothered me. Until that day, my seat was at table 11, the very last table, closest to the kitchen doors. I couldn't help smiling. Even after all these years, they still knew exactly where to put me. Far enough away that important conversations couldn't accidentally include me. I pulled out my chair and sat down between an elderly aunt who called me Emily twice, and one of my father's longtime business associates. He looked pleasant enough. After introducing himself, he smiled politely. "So, Emma, what do you do?" It was the simplest question in the world. One I answered almost every day. I opened my mouth. I own. Before another word could leave my lips, my father answered for me. "Oh, Emma?" He laughed warmly, as though sharing an adorable family joke. "Emma plays in the dirt?" A few people chuckled. He continued. "She grows vegetables, sells them at little weekend markets. We keep hoping she'll eventually get tired of pretending farming is a career." More laughter, light, comfortable. The kind of laughter people give wealthy men because disagreeing would be awkward. I never finished my sentence. Instead, I slowly closed my mouth, reached for my glass of water, and took a sip. The businessman nodded politely. "Oh, that's nice." Then he turned away to continue discussing investment portfolios with someone else. The conversation moved on. As if I hadn't been sitting there at all, I could have corrected him. I could have said, "Actually, Harrison Farms supplies 4 regional grocery chains. We employ 31 full-time workers, nearly 90 seasonal employees. We produce hundreds of thousands of pounds of certified organic crops every year. The herbs you're eating tonight? Mine. The tomatoes on your plate? Mine. Even the flowers decorating your table? Mine." I could have said every one of those things. Instead, I stayed quiet, not because I was weak, because somewhere along the way, I'd convinced myself that people who constantly explain their value are speaking to an audience that has already decided not to hear them. At least, that's what I told myself. The truth? The truth was harder. I was afraid. Afraid that if they finally admired me, they'd only admire the money, not the woman who had earned it. Dinner continued. People laughed. Wine flowed freely. The band played louder. Servers carried out course after course. As each plate passed by, I recognized nearly every ingredient. Fresh basil, baby kale, microgreens, edible flowers, carrots, heirloom tomatoes. Months of work, thousands of hours, all disappearing in a few elegant bites. No one knew, but farmers aren't raised to expect applause. We're raised to expect sunrise. Across the room, I noticed Dolores, the caterer. She caught my eye for just a second. Her expression changed. She'd heard my father's joke. She knew the truth. For a brief moment, I saw anger flash across her face. Not loud anger, the quiet kind. The kind decent people feel when they watch someone be treated unfairly. She started walking toward our table, then stopped. She looked at me. I gave the tiniest shake of my head. Please don't. Today is Daniel's day. She understood immediately. She nodded once, turned around, and disappeared back into the kitchen. Sometimes kindness is knowing when not to rescue someone. Across the ballroom, photographers moved from table to table taking candid pictures. One camera slowly turned toward ours. Its lens paused on me for several seconds. I smiled politely. No one looking at that photograph would ever know what had just happened. Sometimes the deepest humiliation wears the calmest face. Dessert plates were cleared away. Coffee was poured. The music softened. Then my father stood. Immediately, conversations stopped. Glasses were set down. Everyone looked toward him. He loved moments like this. Rooms had always listened when Richard Harrison spoke. He straightened his jacket, lifted his champagne glass, and smiled. My friends, tonight isn't just about celebrating Daniel and Chloe. It's about celebrating family. People nodded. He spoke confidently about success, tradition, legacy, the Harrison name. Every sentence earned another approving smile. Then, his eyes found me. Even from across the ballroom, I knew that look, the one he'd worn my entire life. The look that always came right before turning me into the punchline. I felt my stomach tighten. Without knowing why, I suddenly remembered my mother's voice. The earth doesn't judge what's planted in it. I wish people worked the same way, because in less than 60 seconds, 200 people were about to laugh at the woman who had quietly paid for the room they were standing inside. And this time, the wound would cut deeper than any insult that had come before. My father slowly raised his champagne glass. The crystal caught the light from the chandeliers, scattering tiny reflections across the ballroom. 200 conversations faded into silence. Even the band stopped playing. Richard Harrison had everyone's attention, exactly the way he liked it. He smiled at Daniel first. My son, I've watched you grow into a man your mother would have been proud of. Daniel lowered his head, smiling through tears. My father turned toward Chloe. And Chloe, welcome to the Harrison family. Applause echoed across the room. For a moment, everything felt warm, normal, safe. Then my father looked around the ballroom. His smile widened. You know, family is a funny thing. It isn't about all doing the same job. It's about everyone finding their place. A few people nodded. Someone laughed softly. He took another sip of champagne. I've always believed every family needs different kinds of people. The leaders, the dreamers, the business minds, the hard workers. His eyes slowly searched the room until they stopped on me. Even before he spoke, I knew. I had seen that expression too many times growing up. It was the look he wore whenever he wanted to entertain a room at my expense. He lifted his glass slightly in my direction. And then, he said with a grin, "There's Emma." The room turned toward me. Every face, every eye. I felt 200 strangers looking at the woman in work boots, sitting quietly at table 11. My father chuckled. Our youngest, aFarmer. More laughter. He wasn't finished. You've got to admire her determination. Every morning she wakes up excited to play in the dirt. The room laughed harder. Someone actually clapped. I kept my hands folded beneath the table. My breathing stayed slow, steady. My father continued. I keep telling her, there are easier ways to make a living. But you know farmers, they're stubborn. More laughter. He looked around the ballroom proudly, then stretched one arm toward the towering flower arrangements, toward the elegant decorations, toward the luxury surrounding us. I look around this room tonight, these flowers, this beautiful venue, this incredible celebration. And it makes me wonder, he paused. Perfect timing. He knew exactly how to hold an audience. Then he smiled. When will a farmer ever be able to afford something like this? The ballroom exploded. Laughter rolled across the room. People leaned into each other. Several guests wiped tears from their eyes. The band members laughed. Business partners laughed. Even relatives I'd known my whole life laughed. Nobody realized. They were standing inside the answer to his question. Every orchid hanging above their heads had come from my greenhouse. Every centerpiece, every arrangement, every bouquet, every flower he proudly gestured toward. I had grown. I had harvested them before sunrise. I had delivered them myself. And when the budget came up short, I had quietly written a check for $40,000 so Daniel would never know. My father stood in the middle of a wedding I had helped create, and used it as proof that farmers could never build anything beautiful. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. I slowly placed my fork beside my plate. The tiny sound of silver touching porcelain somehow felt louder than the laughter surrounding me. Across the room, my eyes found Daniel. He wasn't laughing. His smile had disappeared. His face had gone completely still. He looked from my father, to me, back to my father again. His expression said everything. Please don't leave. Please don't make tonight become this. For a brief second, our eyes met. I gave him the smallest shake of my head. No, not today. This was his wedding. He deserved one day untouched by the broken pieces of our family. I would carry mine quietly, just a little longer. The applause finally faded. Guests returned to eating dessert. Conversations picked back up. Within minutes, most people had already forgotten the joke. But I hadn't. Some humiliations don't end when the laughter stops. They echo. I sat there for another 10 minutes, smiling whenever someone looked my way, answering polite questions, pretending nothing had happened. Inside, something had cracked, not loudly, not dramatically. Like old ice finally giving way after years of tiny fractures. For 15 years, I had believed one lie. If I worked hard enough, built something successful enough, became accomplished enough, one day my father would finally see me. He had seen me. He simply refused to value what he saw. There is a difference, and understanding that difference changes everything. I quietly stood from my chair. No one noticed. I slipped through the ballroom toward the kitchen. Old habits die hard. Even after everything, I still wanted to make sure dessert service was running smoothly. The kitchen buzzed with controlled chaos. Servers rushed between stainless steel counters. Chefs plated desserts with military precision. Dolores spotted me immediately. Without saying a word, she crossed the room, wrapped me in the warmest hug, and whispered, "I'm so sorry." That was all. She didn't mention the speech. She didn't need to. Sometimes the people who truly understand pain know silence is enough. I thanked her. Adjusted one tray that had been placed slightly crooked, straightened a flower arrangement near the dessert table, then stepped outside through the service entrance. The cool evening air hit my face. For the first time all night, I could breathe. The city lights shimmered across the parking lot. Luxury sedans lined every row. Mercedes, BMW, Bentley, Porsche. Near the far corner, covered in a light layer of dust from country roads, sat my pickup truck. It looked completely out of place. Kind of like me. I stood there staring at it, thinking about my mother, thinking about the greenhouse, thinking about the little girl who used to believe hard work fixed everything. It doesn't. Hard work grows crops. It doesn't always grow respect. That realization hurt more than my father's joke ever could, because jokes disappear. Truth stays. And I was finally beginning to understand the truth. My father had never been waiting for me to become successful. He had been waiting for me to become someone else. Someone who wore suits instead of boots. Someone who built spreadsheets instead of gardens. Someone whose hands looked soft enough to shake in boardrooms. The tragedy wasn't that I had failed to become that woman. The tragedy was that I had spent 15 years wondering if I should. I reached into my pocket. My fingers touched the tiny white orchid petal I'd picked up earlier that afternoon. It was slightly crushed now. Fragile, beautiful, still whole. Just like dignity. People can bruise it, but only you decide whether to throw it away. I slipped it carefully back into my pocket, walked toward my truck, and drove into the darkness, without knowing that before the week was over, my father would discover that the farmer he had laughed at in front of 200 guests was the only person standing between his company and complete financial collapse. The morning after the wedding, Emma didn't wake up angry. She woke up tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. The kind that comes after carrying hope for too many years. The greenhouse was already alive before sunrise. Workers moved between rows of vegetables. Forklifts carried crates toward waiting trucks, and sprinklers whispered across the fields. Life hadn't stopped simply because her heart had been broken. The land never paused for disappointment. Neither could she. Emma buried herself in work, harvest schedules, quality inspections, supplier calls, invoices. It was easier to think about tomatoes than family. Easier to repair irrigation lines than old wounds. Around noon, Sophia walked into the office holding a sealed envelope. "You've got a visitor." Emma looked up. "Who?" Sophia smiled. "You'd better come see." Parked outside the farmhouse wasn't another pickup truck. It wasn't a delivery van. It wasn't even one of the expensive black sedans Emma had grown used to seeing at business meetings. It was her father's old company car. Richard Harrison stood beside it. For the first time Emma could remember, he looked smaller, older. His shoulders weren't straight. His expensive suit couldn't hide the weight he was carrying. Neither of them spoke at first. The wind moved softly through the fields. Finally, her father looked across the rows of vegetables stretching toward the horizon. "I've never been here," Emma answered quietly. I noticed. Another long silence. Then he said something she had waited half her life to hear. "I was wrong." Not an excuse. Not an explanation. Just 4 simple words. "I was wrong." He slowly walked toward one of the greenhouses. His polished shoes sank slightly into the soft dirt. He looked uncomfortable, not because of the mud, but because he finally understood what it represented. Emma followed a few steps behind. Inside the greenhouse, workers carefully inspected orchids before loading them into refrigerated trucks. Her father watched every movement. No one stopped working because the owner of Harrison Provisions had arrived. They simply smiled at Emma and continued their jobs. After several minutes, he whispered, "All these people, they depend on you." Emma nodded. "They depend on each other." He looked surprised. She smiled. "That's how farms work." They walked deeper into the property. Workers waved. Some stopped to ask Emma questions. Others thanked her for approving overtime during harvest season. One young employee introduced Emma to his newborn daughter. Richard watched every interaction. No one feared Emma. No one performed for her. They respected her, not because of her money, because she showed up every day. Exactly the lesson Ruth Harrison had tried to teach years before. Finally, they reached the wooden gate at the north end of the property. Above it hung a hand-carved cedar sign. Richard read the words slowly. "Character grows where pride cannot." He ran his fingers across the wood. "Your mother's words?" Emma nodded. "I changed them into something I needed to remember." He closed his eyes. "I spent my whole life building buildings. You built people." Emma looked toward the workers laughing together across the fields. "No, I just gave them a place where they could grow." Richard reached into his coat pocket. He removed a small velvet box. Inside was the old Harrison Company ring, the one he had planned to give to whichever child inherited the business. He held it out. Emma looked at it quietly, then gently closed the box. "I don't need your ring." He lowered his hand. "I know. I just wanted you to know it was yours if you wanted it." Emma smiled softly. "I already inherited everything Mom wanted me to have." She looked across 60 acres of rich soil. "The rest was never mine." Weeks passed. The new national contract transformed both businesses. Emma's farm expanded. More workers were hired. Young farmers from nearby counties found stable jobs. Local suppliers grew with them. The entire community benefited. Richard's company survived, not because his daughter rescued his pride, but because she refused to punish innocent employees for mistakes they never made. That decision earned more respect than revenge ever could. Months later, Daniel and Chloe visited the farm. They planted the first apple tree beside the old greenhouse. Sophia laughed as Daniel struggled to hold a shovel correctly. Everyone teased him, even Emma. For the first time in years, family laughter didn't hurt. It healed. Vanessa arrived one Saturday afternoon. She wore expensive boots that were clearly brand new. Within 10 minutes, they were covered in mud. She stared at them in horror. Emma couldn't help laughing. Eventually, Vanessa laughed too. It was awkward, small, but real. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't begin with words. Sometimes it begins with shared embarrassment. One autumn evening, Emma stood alone beside her mother's favorite field. The sun disappeared behind rows of golden crops. The wind carried the familiar scent of fresh earth. She closed her eyes. For years, she had wanted one thing: her father's approval. Now she understood something better. Approval can be taken away. Peace cannot. She finally possessed something no boardroom, no fortune, and no family opinion could ever give her. She respected herself. And once that happened, everyone else's judgment became wonderfully quiet. If this story teaches anything, it is this: people may laugh at the hands that build your future because they cannot imagine what those hands are capable of. Keep building anyway. One day, the same people who underestimated you won't remember your words. They'll remember your work, because success doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes, it grows silently beneath the soil until the entire world has no choice but to notice. 6 months later, the first trucks rolled out before sunrise. Not from a glass tower, not from a corporate headquarters, from a quiet farm where every crate carried the same name that had once been mocked: Harrison Farms. Emma stood beside the loading dock with a clipboard tucked under one arm, watching dozens of employees prepare another shipment. Engines started one by one. Headlights cut through the morning mist, and for the first time in years, she didn't wonder whether she was enough. She already knew. The answer had never belonged to anyone else. The partnership became one of the strongest regional supply programs in the state. Local farmers found new markets. Seasonal workers became full-time employees. Small family farms that had been struggling finally had steady contracts. Emma didn't build success alone. She built a community that mattered more than any title ever could. One crisp autumn afternoon, a familiar black sedan slowly turned onto the gravel road leading to the farm. This time it didn't stop at the gate. It drove all the way to the farmhouse. Richard Harrison stepped out carrying nothing except a worn envelope. He looked around quietly. Children of farm workers were laughing near the orchard. Employees waved at Emma as they passed. Nobody stopped working because the owner had arrived. They simply smiled and kept going. Richard watched it all. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "I spent my whole life trying to build a company." Emma answered softly, "You did." He looked at her. "But you built a place where people actually want to stay." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he handed her the envelope. Inside was an old photograph. Emma, Daniel, and Vanessa as children, standing beside their mother in a muddy vegetable garden. On the back, in Ruth's handwriting, were 6 simple words: "Never confuse wealth with worth." Richard's voice trembled. I finally understand what she meant. Emma smiled through quiet tears. "I think Mom knew one day you would." They never became the perfect family. Some wounds leave scars, but scars are different from open wounds. Vanessa visited more often. Sometimes she came in expensive boots. Sometimes she left wearing borrowed work gloves. Daniel and Chloe planted fruit trees every spring with their children. The farm slowly became the place everyone returned to. Not because it was the richest place, because it was the safest. Years later, visitors driving past the property would notice a simple cedar sign hanging beside the entrance. It didn't advertise awards. It didn't mention contracts. It didn't list profits. It simply read, "Respect grows here." People often asked Emma why she chose those words. She always smiled before answering. Because crops aren't the only things you can grow. The greatest victory wasn't that the people who mocked her finally respected her. The greatest victory was that she no longer needed them to. My boots were still stained with the fresh mud from that morning's harvest. The rich brown soil had dried into the cracks of the leather after hours spent in the greenhouse before sunrise. I had tried to wipe them clean before leaving the farm, but anyone who works the land knows the truth. Some dirt never really comes off. As I stepped into the ballroom, I noticed every eye drifting toward polished Italian shoes, expensive heels, tailored tuxedos, sparkling jewelry, and designer gowns. The crystal chandeliers reflected across marble floors so perfectly that every expensive shoe looked like it was floating on water. Mine looked like they had just walked out of a field. Maybe they had. Around me stood nearly 200 guests. Business owners, lawyers, politicians, executives, people whose watches cost more than my first tractor. Meanwhile, I stood quietly near the entrance wearing simple clothes, work boots, and hands that still carried tiny cuts from trimming orchid stems before dawn. No one greeted me. No one asked if I was family. Several people smiled politely. The same smile reserved for caterers and event staff. I'd gotten used to it years ago. What none of them knew was that every white orchid decorating that magnificent ballroom had been grown in my greenhouse. Every centerpiece, every bouquet, every flower hanging from the ceiling had passed through my hands. The heirloom tomatoes in the salad? Mine. The fresh herbs inside the sauce everyone kept complimenting? Mine. The baby greens served beneath the expensive seafood? Mine too. Even the flowers decorating the wedding cake had come from my farm. And none of them knew that 3 weeks earlier, I had quietly wired $40,000 to the caterer. No recognition, no announcement, no thank you speech. Only one condition. No one was ever to know who paid for any of it.